The most ruined families by closed bloodlines. Dark secrets hidden in cookies. Interior. A story that uncovers generations of isolation and genetic tragedy in America's forgotten corners. In the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, where mountain ridges cut communities off from the outside world, certain families carried burdens heavier than coal from the mines that once sustained them. This is the devastating chronicle of the Blackburn clan, whose century of isolation created a legacy that science, medicine, and society would study for generations to come. The year was 1952, when Drive Martin Coleman first ventured into Stillwater Hollow, a remote valley nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. The young physician, fresh from medical school at the University of Louisville, had accepted a rural posting that few doctors wanted. What he discovered there would haunt him for the remainder of his career. The road simply disappeared into overgrowth about 3 miles before the hollow, Dr. Coleman wrote in his journal. I continued on foot, following what appeared to be a game trail until the trees opened to reveal a clearing with several ramshackle cabins clustered near a creek. The isolation was complete, no telephone lines, no electricity, and based on the reactions I received, very few outside visitors. The Blackburn family had settled in Stillwater Hollow around 1870 when Jeremiah Blackburn, a Civil War veteran, sought solitude after witnessing the horrors of battle. What began as one man's retreat from society evolved over generations into a completely isolated community. By the time Dr. Coleman arrived, approximately 47 individuals lived in the hollow, all descended from Jeremiah and the handful of initial settlers, including his 2 sisters and their husbands. As Coleman approached the largest cabin, he noticed several adults sitting on the porch. Their wary eyes followed his every move. A man who appeared to be in his 50s but was likely much younger, later identified as Elijah Blackburn, the family patriarch, stepped forward. "Ain't seen your kind around here before," Elijah said, his speech noticeably slurred. Coleman observed that the man's facial features appeared asymmetrical, with one eye significantly lower than the other. "I'm the new doctor for the county," Coleman replied. "I'm making rounds to introduce myself." The tension was palpable as Coleman was reluctantly invited to examine several family members who had been suffering from various ailments. What he documented that day would form the basis for one of the most significant studies on the effects of genetic isolation in American medical literature. 8 of the 17 children in the hollow displayed concerning physical characteristics, facial asymmetry, unusual gait patterns, and various skeletal malformations. 5 adults demonstrated signs of diminished cognitive development. Most troubling to Coleman was the high infant mortality rate. The family graveyard contained dozens of small markers for children who hadn't survived beyond their first year. The situation became clear as I spoke with Sarah. Elijah's wife. Coleman noted she referred to her husband as Cousin Elijah multiple times. Further conversation revealed that Sarah and Elijah shared the same grandparents. This pattern of familial unions appeared to be the norm rather than the exception in Stillwater Hollow. Coleman's return visits revealed more about the Blackburn family history. Economic necessity, geographic isolation, and generational distrust of outsiders had created conditions where marriage between close relatives became commonplace. By the 3rd generation in the hollow, the genetic pool had become dangerously limited. The consequences were evident in Elijah and Sarah's youngest child, 6-year-old Rebecca. The girl suffered from severe developmental delays, could not speak in complete sentences, and had a malformed heart that caused her lips and fingertips to appear blue. Coleman estimated she would not survive to adulthood without significant medical intervention. The family could not afford and was reluctant to seek. "What troubles me most," Coleman wrote, "is not just the medical conditions I'm observing, but the complete social isolation that perpetuates this cycle. These families have no access to education, limited understanding of genetics, and a deeply ingrained fear of the outside world that prevents them from seeking assistance." When Coleman attempted to explain the concept of genetic disorders resulting from consanguineous relationships, Elijah became defensive. "My poor married his first cousin and his poor before him did the same." Elijah told him, "We keep to ourselves because the outside world ain't never shown us nothing but trouble. Our ways are our own." The doctor's visits to Stillwater Hollow continued for nearly 2 years before local authorities became involved. An anonymous report, though many suspected it was Coleman himself, led to an investigation by County Social Services in late 1954. The subsequent findings shocked the regional medical community and eventually gained national attention. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't find these untold stories of America's hidden genetic tragedies anywhere else. Subscribe now to uncover the truth that history tried to forget. The county investigation into still water. A hollow revealed conditions that officials described as medieval. Records were sparse as many births and deaths had never been registered with authorities. The Blackburn family's isolation had created a community frozen in time with little education, minimal health care, and generations of intermarriage that had devastating genetic consequences. Historical records gathered by investigators showed that Jeremiah Blackburn had initially settled the hollow with his two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and their husbands in 1870. A small number of other families joined them. But by the 1890s, most had moved on, leaving primarily Blackburns in the isolated valley. Cut off from neighboring communities by rugged terrain and with limited transportation options, the family turned inward for marriages and partnerships. Dr. Abigail Winters, a geneticist who reviewed Dr. Coleman's findings in 1955, explained, "What we're seeing in the Blackburn family is a textbook case of genetic bottlenecking. When a population becomes isolated and reproduces primarily within itself, recessive genes that might otherwise remain dormant have a much higher chance of expression. The physical and cognitive challenges observed in this community are consistent with known effects of consanguinity over multiple generations." The most severe cases documented among the Blackburn children included David Blackburn, age 12, who had been born with 6 fingers on each hand and severe curvature of the spine that left him unable to stand upright. Despite his physical challenges, David demonstrated remarkable mechanical aptitude, creating intricate wooden toys with simple tools. Twins, Mary and Martha Blackburn, age 9, who both exhibited significantly delayed cognitive development and shared an unusual condition where their skin was extremely sensitive to sunlight, forcing them to remain indoors during daylight hours. Joseph Blackburn, age 4, who had not yet developed speech and displayed repetitive rocking behaviors. His eyes, unusual in their pale blue color, seemed unable to focus on objects or people. Rebecca Blackburn, the youngest at age 6, whose heart condition had worsened since Dr. Coleman's initial visit. Her limited energy meant she spent most days in bed listening to stories told by her older siblings. The investigation revealed that infant mortality in the hollow approached 60%, nearly 10 times the national average in the 1950s. Those who survived often faced lifelong health challenges. Adult Blackburn showed higher rates of early-onset arthritis, respiratory problems, and cardiac issues than the general population. The situation represents a complex interplay of genetics, geography, economics, and culture, noted sociologist Dr. Frank Harrison, who joined the investigation team in early 1955. These families didn't choose isolation initially. It was thrust upon them by economic hardship in the challenging Appalachian terrain. Over time, that geographic isolation transformed into social isolation, reinforced by negative experiences when they did venture into nearby towns. Historical records showed that when Blackburn family members had attempted to integrate with neighboring communities, they often faced discrimination and ridicule for their appearance and limited education. This treatment reinforced their retreat from outside society and strengthened their reliance on their own closed community. The family's economic situation exacerbated their isolation. The coal mines that had once provided income had closed in the 1930s. The Blackburns survived through subsistence farming, hunting, and occasional craft sales in distant markets. Their poverty meant no resources for education, health care, or transportation that might have broken the cycle of isolation. Emma Blackburn, one of the few family members who had spent time outside the hollow after marrying a logger from a neighboring county in the 1940s, provided investigators with valuable insights into the family's perspective. "My relatives don't see themselves as suffering or needing rescue," Emma explained. "This hollow is the only home they've known. They have their own ways, their own rules, their own understanding of family. They know the children aren't always born healthy, but they believe that's just their cross to bear, not something caused by their family arrangements." Emma had returned to Stillwater Hollow after her husband's death in a logging accident, bringing with her some knowledge of the outside world, but ultimately reintegrating into the community's established patterns. The investigation reached a critical turning, a point when medical authorities determined that several of the younger Blackburn children, particularly Rebecca, with her heart condition, required immediate medical intervention to survive. This set the stage for a complex legal and ethical battle that would challenge both medical professionals and the fiercely independent Blackburn family. Dr. Coleman, who had by now developed a tenuous trust with the family, found himself caught between his obligation to his patients and the growing pressure from authorities to intervene more dramatically in the Hollow's affairs. These people aren't monsters, Coleman argued in a meeting with county officials. They're the product of historical forces, geographic isolation, and generational poverty. Any intervention that doesn't acknowledge their humanity and/or dignity will fail and likely drive them further into isolation. As 1955 drew to a close, the situation in Stillwater Hollow had gained attention beyond Kentucky. Medical journals published anonymized versions of Dr. Coleman's findings, and social welfare organizations began to debate the ethical considerations of intervention for the Blackburn family who had lived for generations according to their own rules. The outside world was closing in, bringing both promise and peril. The winter of 1995-56 proved particularly harsh in the Kentucky mountains. Heavy snowfall further isolated Stillwater Hollow, cutting off even the tenuous connection Dr. Coleman had established. When he finally managed to reach the community in late February, he found a dire situation. Young Rebecca Blackburn's condition had deteriorated significantly, and 3 other children were suffering from respiratory infections that had turned dangerous without medical care. "I can no longer stand by as a passive observer," Coleman wrote in his journal. Whatever the cultural and ethical complexities, these children need immediate medical intervention or they will not survive. What followed was an unprecedented operation that local newspapers would later call the Stillwater Rescue. Coleman contacted state authorities, who mobilized a team including medical personnel, social workers, and even National Guard members with snow-capable vehicles. On March 3, 1956, this team entered Stillwater Hollow, not without resistance from some family members. Elijah Blackburn stood at the entrance to the hollow, shotgun in hand as the vehicles approached. The standoff lasted nearly 3 hours, with Coleman attempting to mediate between increasingly impatient authorities and the frightened family patriarch. "They're coming to take our children," Elijah insisted. "They'll split us apart and destroy everything we've built here." The situation diffused only when Sarah Blackburn emerged from their cabin carrying Rebecca, whose lips had turned a dangerous shade of blue. "Help her," Sarah said simply, walking past her husband toward the medical team. This pivotal moment, a mother's desperation overriding generations of isolation, marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Blackburn family. Within hours, 4 children, including Rebecca, were transported to the regional hospital. Within days, social services had begun assessing the situation of all 17 children in the hollow. The medical interventions were immediately life-saving. Rebecca underwent surgery to repair a congenital heart defect that would have been routine if performed years earlier. The other children received treatment for acute conditions and began comprehensive health assessments that revealed the full extent of their genetic challenges. The range of conditions we're observing all point to recessive genetic disorders becoming expressed through consanguineous relationships, noted Dr. Eleanor Phillips, the pediatric specialist overseeing the children's care. Many of these conditions would be extremely rare in the general population but appear at much higher rates in isolated genetic communities. While the immediate medical crisis had been addressed, the broader questions loomed larger. What would happen to the Blackburn family now? Could they return to their isolated existence? Should the children be permanently removed from their parents' care? These questions divided the medical and social work communities. Some advocated for complete family separation, arguing that the parents' choices had endangered their children. Others, including Dr. Coleman, pushed for a more nuanced approach. These people didn't choose to create genetic disorders. Coleman argued they were acting according to the only social structure they knew in isolation from modern education and healthcare. Punishing them serves no purpose. Educating them offers the only sustainable path forward. The compromised solution that emerged became a case study in cultural intervention. The younger Blackburn children were temporarily placed in foster care while receiving necessary medical treatment. The older family members, including parents, were offered a program combining education, job training, and housing assistance if they agreed to relocate to a small town about 30 miles from the Hollow. The transition proved extraordinarily difficult. Adults who had never used electricity or indoor plumbing struggled with basic aspects of modern life. Children who had never attended formal school faced both educational and social challenges. The family structure that had defined their existence for generations was fundamentally altered. Sarah Blackburn, speaking to a social worker 6 months into the transition, expressed the family's complex emotions. "I know my Rebecca would have died without that operation. I'm grateful every day to see her running and playing now. But we've lost something, too. Our home, our ways. We're strangers here." If you've been touched by the Blackburn family's struggle, type "Genetics Matters" in the comments below. Your voice helped spread awareness about America's forgotten communities and the generations who suffered in silence. The Blackburn case gradually transformed from a local incident to a significant influence on public health policy. By 1957, medical schools were using anonymized data from the family to teach about genetic disorders. Social workers studied the intervention as both a success and a cautionary tale about cultural sensitivity. 4. The children, the outcomes varied dramatically. Those young enough to adapt fully to their new environment generally thrived with proper medical care and education. Older family members often struggled with depression, substance abuse, and a profound sense of displacement. Rebecca, whose heart condition had precipitated the intervention, became something of a success story. By age 10, she had caught up academically with her peers and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. Her physical health, while still requiring monitoring, had stabilized following her surgery. What happened to the Blackburns represents both a medical and an ethical watershed, observed Dr. Harrison in a 1960 paper on the case. We must balance our obligation to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly children, with respect for cultural differences and family autonomy. There are no easy answers, only complex trade-offs. As the 1960s progressed, the Blackburn family case became increasingly significant in medical and scientific circles. Researchers from major universities sought permission to study the family's genetic makeup, creating detailed pedigree charts that trace certain conditions through multiple generations. Dr. William Harris, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University who studied the Blackburn case extensively, explained the scientific significance. What we're observing in this family provides real-world evidence of genetic principles that previously existed primarily in textbooks. The expression of recessive traits, the compounding effects of genetic bottlenecking, and the specific manifestations of various disorders all become clearer when studied in this context. The scientific understanding of consanguinity and its effects had evolved considerably since the initial discovery of the Blackburn family. By the 1960s, researchers could identify specific patterns in certain disorders. The facial asymmetry common among family members was linked to a recessive gene that affected craniofacial development during the first trimester of pregnancy. In the general population, this gene was estimated to appear in fewer than 1 in 500 individuals. In the Blackburn family, it appeared in approximately 1 in 4 individuals. The heart defects that had threatened Rebecca's life were connected to another recessive trait that affected cardiac development. The specific type of defect seen in the Blackburns was normally extremely rare, occurring in approximately 1 in 25,000 births in the general population. Among the Blackburns, it appeared in roughly 1 in 8 births. The cognitive developmental delays observed in many family members were more complex, likely resulting from multiple genetic factors compounded by environmental conditions, including poor nutrition and limited stimulation during critical developmental periods. What makes the Blackburn case particularly valuable from a scientific perspective is the detailed medical documentation that spans generations, noted Dr. Harris. Dr. Coleman's initial work combined with subsequent monitoring gives us insight into how these genetic conditions manifest and progress over time. By 1965, blood samples and genetic material from consenting Blackburn family members were being used in research laboratories across the country. Their genetic legacy was helping advance understanding of hereditary disorders even as the family itself continued to adjust to life outside their hollow. The scientific impact extended beyond genetics into public health policy. Kentucky and several other states with significant rural and isolated populations implemented new outreach programs specifically targeting remote communities. Mobile health clinics began visiting previously underserved areas, offering basic care and education about genetic health. Educational materials developed for these programs carefully balanced medical accuracy with cultural sensitivity. Rather than condemning traditional practices outright, they emphasized the health benefits of genetic diversity and provided information about how closely related individuals might share genes that could cause health problems in children. The approach had to be educational rather than judgmental, explained Dr. Margaret Wilson, who developed materials for Kentucky's Rural Health Initiative. Many isolated communities had developed customs of familial marriage over generations due to geographic necessity, not out of any intent to cause harm. Our goal was to provide information that would allow them to make more informed choices going forward. The Blackburn case also influenced how medical professionals approached genetic counseling. Prior to this case, such counseling was rare and typically only available in major metropolitan areas. By the late 1960s, training programs for rural doctors began including modules on identifying potential genetic concerns and providing basic counseling. As scientific understanding of genetics advanced through the 1960s, researchers gained the ability to identify carriers of certain recessive traits. Individuals who showed no symptoms themselves, but could pass conditions to their children if their partner carried the same recessive gene. Several adult Blackburn family members participated in this early carrier testing, providing valuable data while gaining information about their own genetic makeup. For many, this knowledge helped guide family planning decisions as they established new lives away from Stillwater Hollow. "I never understood why so many of our babies didn't survive," Emma Blackburn told researchers in a 1967 interview. "Now I know it wasn't a curse or punishment like some folks in the Hollow believed. It was something in our blood, something science can explain. That knowledge doesn't erase the pain, but it helps make sense of it." The scientific understanding gained from studying the Blackburn case and similar isolated communities ultimately contributed to broader public awareness about genetic health. By the early 1970s, basic information about genetic disorders and the increased risks associated with consanguinity had begun to appear in high school biology textbooks and public health materials. For the Blackburn family members themselves, this scientific legacy represented a complicated contribution to society. Many expressed pride that their family struggles had helped advance medical knowledge even as they continued to process the trauma of their disrupted lives and lost community. By the mid-1970s, 20 years after the intervention at Stillwater Hollow, the ripples of the Blackburn family case continued to spread through medicine, social policy, and the lives of the family members themselves. The once unified community had scattered across Kentucky and neighboring states with varying degrees of integration into mainstream society. Rebecca Blackburn, whose heart condition had precipitated the original intervention, graduated from college in 1972, the first member of her family to achieve this milestone. She chose to study social work, motivated by her own family's experience. "I remember very little of life in the Hollow," Rebecca explained in a 1975 interview. "My earliest clear memories are of the hospital after my surgery. But I've spent my life hearing the stories, both the hardships my family endured and how their experiences helped others. I wanted to be part of continuing that positive legacy." Rebecca's work focused specifically on rural Appalachian communities that remained isolated from mainstream healthcare. Her personal background gave her unique credibility when approaching families suspicious of outside interference. Not all Blackburn family stories ended as positively. Elijah, who had initially resisted the intervention, never fully adjusted to life outside the Hollow. He struggled with alcoholism and died in 1968, having spent his final years expressing a desire to return to the isolation of Stillwater. Sarah outlived her husband by nearly a decade, gradually becoming more comfortable with her new circumstances. Before her death in 1977, she became an unexpected ally in public health outreach, occasionally accompanying medical teams to speak with families in situations similar to what the Blackburns had experienced. "I don't judge anyone's choices," Sarah would tell these families. But I wish someone had explained to me years earlier how our family arrangements were affecting our children's health. Knowledge doesn't have to destroy tradition. It can help preserve what's most important, the children themselves. The long-term medical outcomes for the Blackburn children varied considerably based largely on their ages at the time of intervention. Those who were infants or very young children in 1956 generally developed normally once provided with appropriate medical care, nutrition, and education. Those who were older at the time of intervention often continued to struggle with both physical and psychological challenges. David Blackburn, who had been born with skeletal malformations, underwent multiple surgeries throughout his teens. Though the procedures improved his mobility, he continued to experience chronic pain and limited function. Nevertheless, he developed his mechanical aptitude into a career repairing agricultural equipment work that allowed him to support himself while accommodating his physical limitations. The twins, Mary and Martha, followed different paths. Mary adapted relatively well to life outside the Hollow, eventually marrying and having 2 children of her own after genetic counseling confirmed her specific recessive traits posed minimal risk when partnered with someone from outside the family. Martha struggled more significantly with social integration and remained dependent on supportive care throughout her adult life. Joseph, who had not developed speech by age 4, was eventually diagnosed with a complex developmental disorder. With intensive intervention, he gained limited verbal communication skills, but required lifelong support. He found his greatest connection through music, developing remarkable ability with several instruments despite his other challenges. By 1975, the original Stillwater Hollow had been largely reclaimed by nature. The cabins had collapsed and forested that overgrown the cleared areas where the Blackburns once farmed. Only the small family cemetery remained visible, a solemn reminder of the generations who had lived and died in isolation. The scientific and medical legacy of the Blackburn case continued to evolve. Blood samples and genetic material provided by consenting family members in the 1960s remain valuable research resources into the 1970s and beyond. As genetic science advanced, researchers gained new tools to understand the specific mechanisms behind the conditions observed in the family. The Blackburn case represents an important bridge between historical understanding of consanguinity and modern genetic medicine. Observe Dr. Elizabeth Chun, who studied the family's genetic samples using techniques not available during the initial intervention. We can now identify the specific gene mutations involved in many of the conditions that affected this family, allowing for much more precise genetic counseling and potential interventions. The social policy implications proved equally enduring. The Blackburn case influenced how authorities approached isolated communities throughout Appalachia and similar regions. Rather than forceful interventions, emphasis shifted toward education, outreach, and voluntary participation in healthcare. We learned that lasting change requires trust and respect, noted Dr. Coleman, reflecting on the case 20 years later. The medical necessity of intervention in the Blackburn case was clear, but the manner of that intervention created unnecessary trauma. Today's approaches are more measured, more culturally informed, and ultimately more effective. For the scattered members of the Blackburn family, the legacy was deeply personal. Many chose to have children of their own, armed with genetic knowledge that their parents and grandparents had lacked. Others decided against having biological children, concerned about the genetic burdens they might pass on despite modern medical reassurances. Family reunions held sporadically since the 1960s became both celebrations of survival and commemorations of loss. The lost community, the lost simplicity of life in the Hollow, and the many family members who had not survived the genetic consequences of their isolation. At one such reunion in 1976, Rebecca Blackburn, now a poised young professional rather than the sickly child who had catalyzed change, addressed her assembled relatives. Our family story isn't just about suffering or medical case studies. It's about resilience. How we've adapted. How we've survived. The Hollow shaped us for better and worse. The intervention changed us. But we're still Blackburns. Still connected by more than just blood. We're connected by our shared history and our shared future. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these forgotten American stories. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end so I can get to know who really appreciates the channel's content. Don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden histories that shaped our nation. Like this video to help others discover these important stories and share it with someone who appreciates learning about the complex tapestry of American history. Your support ensures these forgotten voices continue to be heard.